No matter what you've seen in Western movies, the good old-fashioned pistol duel scenes are the most iconic. A scene where you see the lawman and an outlaw meeting at a high noon to see who is faster on the draw, a test on who uses the gun better. The truth is, these things didn't happen at the time, but if you've heard the story of how Wild Bill was shot at the back of his head while playing cards, you'd know how gruesome gunslingers were. However, if you think the Western movie characters are bloody, it's all courtesy of the real gunslingers that have threaded the soils of the Old West. Make sure you watch this video to the end to find out the deadliest gunslingers in the history of the Old West. Number 12. Jim Miller. We start with Jim Miller, the man whose temper was way too high. It was too high that he killed his first victim after they argued. But it wasn't always like that for Jim. He was born in Van Buren, Arkansas, but his parents migrated to Franklin, Texas, when he was 1 year old, and he grew up there. His father, Jacob Miller, was a stonemason and helped build the first Capitol building in Austin. But just a few years after the migration, tragedy struck the Millers. Jim's father died, so their mom had to move the family to Avant, Texas, to live with her parents. But in 1869, when Jim was just 8, his grandparents were found murdered in their home. While it is unclear who murdered the two, Jim was arrested, but he was never persecuted for it. After Jim was released, he went to live with his sister Georgia and her husband, John Thomas Coop, at their farm at Plum Creek near Gatesville. But the relationship wouldn't go well, as Jim was always getting into an argument with John Thomas. All of that would stop on July 30, 1884, after they had another argument. Jim took a shotgun and shot John Thomas to death while he was sleeping. That was the first time Jim was convicted of murder. He was then sentenced to life in prison. The conviction, however, was overturned on a technicality. After leaving the Coop farm, Jim became a hired hand on the McCulloch County ranch of Emmanuel Clements, cousin of outlaw John Wesley Harden. Despite his legal issues, Jim joined the Texas Rangers and worked as a resident ranger in Memphis, Texas. Later, he served in Hall County. At that time, he killed a man in the neighboring county of Collingsworth in the course of his work. During the 1902 summers, Jim killed 2 men and injured one. He claimed the 3 were caught stealing cattle in Ward County. He also killed lawyer James Jarrett on August 28, 1902. Jarrett had defended area farmers near Lubbock who were raising fences against cattle. Ranchers took them to court, believing that the fences disrupted the grazing of their cattle. Those ranchers hired Jim to murder Jarrett, paying $500. Jim caught Jarrett while watering his horses near his farm, and he had to shoot him 4 times. Jim continued to take lives and do different things until everything went south, and he, together with his crew, was caught. Jim remained stoic while the other 3 reportedly begged for their lives. All Jim had to say was that his diamond ring be given to his wife and that he be permitted to wear his black hat while being hanged. And yes, his requests were granted. He also wanted to die in his black coat, but the authorities probably thought it was too much for anyone with the level of his crime. Jim reportedly was not sober when he was going to be hung. He didn't wait for anyone to do it. He just stepped down from the box, and that was the end of his reckless and bitter life. Number 11. John Wesley Harden. As for John Wesley Harden, the first time he killed was when he was just 15 and went on to kill as many as 44. He was a gunfighter and outlaw in the Wild West during the late 19th century. John believed he was a man who more often sinned against than a sinner himself. He was an addicted gambler who made most of his money betting on horses or dealing in cattle. John Harden left his mark on history as one of the Wild West's most skilled gunmen, killing at least 21 men in duels and ambushes between 1868 and 1877. Harden himself, however, put that number closer to 44. Just as you may have expected, a man like Harden is bound to make some enemies along the way. And in the case of John Harden, he had a $4,000 bounty on his head. But instead of getting bothered by anything, he spent his days gambling and drinking, and also taking another man's wife as his lover. You see, John's parents created for him a different path, but he seems to not want to do it. He was named John Wesley Harden after the founder of the Methodist branch of Protestantism. One crazy saying of John is that he never killed anyone who didn't deserve it, but another story he recounted casts some doubt on that claim. One night, while John Harden was staying at a hotel in Abilene, a man named Charles Cougar was snoring loudly in the room next door to him. Harden pounded on the wall, but the man didn't wake up. To try and wake the man, John fired his gun and shot a bullet through the wall. When the snoring stopped and the man made no other sound, Harden realized he had aimed too low and shot the man dead. But that was not even the the incident that solidified his spot in history. It happened in 1874 on John's 21st birthday. Celebrating a big win at the horse races, Harden and a few companions got incredibly drunk and drew the ire of Comanche, Texas, Deputy Sheriff Charles Webb. The two got into a duel and John won. But a lot of people were not happy about it, forcing John to be on the run with a $4,000 bounty on his head. He was eventually sentenced to 25 years in prison back in 1877. 25 years is a whole lot if you ask me, and that's what John thought as he tried to escape multiple times. But because it was hard to escape, John Harden read up on theology and law and even became superintendent of the prison's Sunday school. By 1894, he was reformed into a law-abiding citizen and pardoned for his crimes. Following his pardon, John was admitted to the state bar and left town for El Paso, intending to set up a law practice. But John's effort to live a decent life didn't go for long. While acting as a defense attorney for a man named Martin Moroz, a cattle thief, John took an interest in Martin's wife, and soon enough, the two became lovers. Martin found out and was angry. He paid lawman George Scarborough to punish John, but Scarborough betrayed him, and he was gunned down at the border. It was rumored that John hired the men to assassinate his client before he could get revenge. But soon, on August 19, 1895, one of the lawmen involved in Martin's murder, John Selman, found John Harden in the Acme Saloon in El Paso and shot him in the back of the head. It is speculated that John was murdered because he didn't pay Selman for killing Martin's. Number 10. Doc Holliday. One of the names that isn't hard to come by when talking about the history of the Old West is Doc Holliday, named John Henry. Born on August 14, 1851, Doc Holliday lost his mother to tuberculosis when he was just 15. This was hard for John because his relationship with his mother was very close. He earned a Doctor of Dental Surgery degree and soon began work as a dentist in the office of Dr. Arthur C. Ford in Atlanta, Georgia. Shortly after starting his dental practice, Doc Holliday discovered that he had contracted tuberculosis, most likely from his mother before she died. His adopted Mexican brother was also diagnosed with the disease and later died, so he may have also contracted it from him. Doc consulted several physicians who told him he had only a short time to live and was encouraged to move to a drier climate to extend his life. On October 1873, Doc Holliday packed up and headed for Dallas, Texas, the railroad's end at the time. However, as time goes on, Doc is forced to find another way to earn a living. He was intelligent, so he became a natural at gambling. Howie, his life was miserable as he had limited time to live. He became moody and drank heavily while still gambling. He knew gambling was dangerous, so he needed a way to protect himself. Dedicated, he started practicing with a 6-shooter and a long, wicked knife, honing his skills. Soon, he had time to put his practice into use. On January 2, 1875, Doc and a local saloon keeper named Austin had a disagreement, which quickly turned to violence. While several shots were fired, neither man was struck, and both men were arrested. At first, the local citizens thought the gunfight was amusing until a few days later, when Doc again got into a disagreement, killing a prominent citizen with 2 carefully aimed bullets. Again, on August 1879, Doc argued with a local gunman named Mike Gordon. The two took the argument to the street, where Doc politely invited Gordon to start shooting whenever he felt like it. Gordon accepted this invitation and died with 3 shots in his belly. That was how deadly Doc Holliday was, but he lived with something deadlier. While he hoped to take advantage of the reputed curative power of the waters, the sulfurous fumes from the spring might have done his lungs more harm than good. He soon lay dying, and there on his dying bed, he looked at his feet to see he had his boots on, and he said, "This is funny," as he had always known he would die with his boots on. November 8, 1887 was the day Doc Holliday breathed his last breath. His name remains in the history books, too many years after. Number 9. Frank Buckskin. This is a take of not just a gunslinger, but an ill-tempered one. Frank Leslie was always violent, especially whenever he drank. He earned the nickname Buckskin while working as an army scout in the Plains Indian Wars. According to history, Leslie opened the Cosmopolitan Hotel in the mining town of Tombstone, Arizona. Shortly thereafter, he committed his first known murder, shooting Mike Killeen in a dispute over the man's wife. The killing was officially ruled to have been in self-defense, but suspicion of foul play arose when Leslie married Killeen's widow 2 months later. 2 years later, after Leslie badly pistol-whipped a man outside the Oriental Saloon, many Tombstone citizens began to suspect Leslie was a dangerous man. He was also accused of taking the life of gunslinger John Ringo, but the law enforcement was unable to prove him guilty. However, Billy Claiborne, a friend of Ringo's, was so certain Leslie was the murderer that he called him out, and in return, the poor man was shot to death by Leslie. Even among the notorious rabble of gunslingers and killers in Tombstone, Leslie was unusually violent. violent. He terrified the people of Tombstone, who finally got the chance to get rid of him in 1889. 2 years earlier, Leslie had divorced his wife and taken up with a Tombstone prostitute named Blonde Molly Williams. The relationship eventually soured, and in a drunken fit of rage, Leslie shot the defenseless woman dead. With testimony from a ranch hand who had witnessed the killing, a Tombstone jury convicted Leslie of murder and sentenced him to 25 years. But surprisingly, Leslie won parole with the aid of a young divorcee named Belle Stowell, whom he soon married. But unfortunately, his fortune declined and soon disappeared from history. No one knows anything of his death till today. Number 8. John King Fischer. The case of John King Fischer was very different from others. He was a rancher, an outlaw, and even a lawman. He was born in Collin County in 1854 to Joby and Lucinda Fischer. Just before the Civil War, the family moved to Florence, Williamson County. It all started in 1869 when Fischer was accused of stealing a horse after he borrowed it without telling the owner. He was arrested by a posse, but reportedly escaped with the help of the horse's owner, who had decided not to press charges. Fischer made his way to Goliad, where he was arrested again, this time for housebreaking, and sent to prison. After being pardoned 4 months later, he moved to Dimmitt County and established a ranch on Pendencia Creek. The region, known as the Nueces Strip, was a lawless area where cattle rustling was the major industry. Fischer, relying on both patronage and intimidation, quickly established himself as one of the leaders of the strip, and his ranch became a haven for drifters, criminals, and rustlers in the region. In the section where he reigned, Fischer was feared and respected. A certain road branch bore the sign, "This is King Fischer's road, take the other." A sign was placed to distinguish between his private road and the public road, but many at the time viewed it as evidence of the extent of Fischer's power and control. Fischer engaged in so many things from cattle theft to violence, but especially for shooting people to death. He soon decided to live a quiet life as he managed to escape conviction. In 1881, he was appointed deputy sheriff of Uvalde County. He turned out to be an efficient and popular lawman and made plans to run for office in 1884. But on the night of March 11, 1884, in the Vaudeville Variety Theater in San Antonio, Fischer and his companion, noted gunman Ben Thompson, were involved in a shootout brought on by a quarrel between Thompson and the theater's owners. Fischer got involved, and neither him or Thompson survived that bloodbath. Number 7. Bas Reeves. Bas Reeves never had it easy from the get-go. He was born to slave parents in 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas. He was owned by a man named Williams Reeves, whose surname Bas took like other slaves at the time. His first name came from his grandfather, Bas Washington. Bas started as a water boy until he was old enough to become a field hand, working alongside his parents. In about 1846, William Reeves moved his operations, family, and slaves to Grayson County, Texas. Soon, George Reeves, Williams's son, inherited Bas, who he took to the battle with him at the time of war. It is unclear how and when Bas gained his freedom, but it is known that it was around the 13th Amendment's abolition of slavery in 1865. As a freedman, Bas returned to Arkansas and farmed near Van Buren. Bas and his family farmed until 1875, when Isaac Parker was appointed federal judge for the Indian Territory. One of Parker's first official acts was to appoint U.S. Marshal James F. Fagan as head of some 200 deputies he was then told to hire. Fagan heard of Bas Reeves's significant knowledge of the area, as well as his ability to speak several tribal languages, and soon recruited him as a U.S. deputy. Bas Reeves became the first black U.S. deputy marshal west of the Mississippi River, and one of the greatest frontier heroes in the nation's history. Sometimes he appeared as a cowboy, farmer, gunslinger, or outlaw himself, but one thing was certain: he never missed the use of his gun. He went after gangs and would end up bringing them to justice. And when they tried to outsmart him, he was 5 times faster. An example is the incident of 1889 when Bas went after Tom Story's gang of horse thieves in Texas. He waited along the route that the gang was known to have used and surprised Tom Story with an arrest warrant. Tom panicked and drew his gun, but Bas drew faster and shot him dead. For Bas, there was no mercy for a non-compliant outlaw. Number 6. Wild Bill. Wild Bill was not born Wild Bill, but his story was too wild to be called by his real name, James Butler Hickok. He was probably the most famous Deadwood resident, even though he was only in town for a few short weeks. James Hickok arrived in Deadwood, along with Colorado Charlie Utter and Calamity Jane, in July of 1876. He was a well-known gambler and gunslinger, participating in many shootouts before coming to Deadwood. Wild Bill won't spare anyone when it comes to putting himself first. Before the Civil War, Wild Bill was a driver, but he soon came to Rock Creek Station in Jefferson County, Nebraska territory, which the company had agreed to purchase from David McCandless, whom Wild Bill had a relationship with. But soon, a dispute over funds from the sale of the station made Wild Bill kill McCandless. But his wild take soon came to an end on August 2, 1876. In Nuttall and Mann's saloon, Jack McCall shot Wild Bill from behind while playing poker. When he died, Wild Bill was holding a pair of aces and eights. That series of cards became known to poker players all around the world as the dead man's hand. Such an influence. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. In the dark world of gunslingers of the Old West, these three gunslingers are believed to be the most brutal of all. Judging from the way they lived their lives, they seem so deadly that no one makes a list of the most brutal people without mentioning them. If you've heard about any of these people, what can you say about them? Let us know in the comments section. Number 5, Porter Rockwell. This man is known for many things, including Mormon church founder Joseph Smith, Jr.'s bodyguard, his loyalty and generosity, as much as his tenacity and ruthlessness as a lawman in Utah. Not much is known about Peter, and he didn't keep a diary. Conflicting information put his birth as either June 28, 1813 or June 25, 1815. But we know for sure that as a young man, he became personal friends of the slightly older Joseph Smith. Following Smith to New York, the Rockwell family would become some of the earliest members of the Latter-day Saint movement, with Porter being baptized in the church on the day it was founded on April 1830. After the New York branch of the church relocated to Ohio, Porter was sent on to Jackson County, Missouri, the intended central gathering place for church members. It was in Missouri that Porter would become proficient with a gun. While it is believed he killed many men as a gunfighter, religious enforcer, and deputy marshal, Porter told a crowd in 1869, "I never killed anyone who didn't need killing." However, many considered him an outlaw, suspecting him in the murders of several in service to the church. This included the Aiken affair, an incident involving 6 professional gamblers from California who would be murdered, allegedly by Porter, while being escorted out of Utah territory in 1857. Porter would be indicted for the incident some 20 years later, but died before his trial. Number 4, Billy the Kid. You must have heard about Billy the Kid one way or the other and wonder why he's more famous than other gunslingers. It's all because Billy the Kid was actually a kid who never lived as a kid. His real name is Henry McCarty, aka William Henry. He lost his father very early, and soon after, his mom contracted tuberculosis. This disease eventually led to the death of Billy's mother, after which Billy and his younger brother were taken to a foster home. At 14, Billy was forced to work in a hotel, washing dishes and waiting tables at the restaurant. Billy was friendly, and so the manager liked him. Billy was a normal boy who wouldn't cause any problems and was always ready to help out with the chores. However, on September 23, 1875, Billy was arrested for hiding a bundle of stolen clothes for a man. It was shocking because the manager trusted Billy so much. 2 days after Billy was thrown in jail, the scrawny teen escaped, worming his way up the jailhouse chimney. From that point onward, Billy would be a fugitive. Now an outlaw and unable to find honest work, the kid met up with another bandit named Jesse Evans, the leader of a gang of rustlers called the Boys. Billy didn't have anywhere else to go, and since it was suicide to be alone in the hostile and lawless territory, he reluctantly joined the gang. Billy was actively carrying out orders, thereby killing several people. He also went into hiding, but would soon start to steal livestock from white ranchers and Apache on the Mescalero reservation. He had a lot of indictment on him that he had to make a deal with the governor. He had to testify against other criminals, and when he did, he was denied freedom as promised. However, Billy was a skilled escape artist and slipped out of his handcuffs and fled. Soon, Billy made a new friend known as Pat Garrett, who was later elected sheriff of Lincoln County. As sheriff, Garrett was charged with arresting his friend Henry McCarty, who by now was almost exclusively known as Billy the Kid. Around the same time, Billy had formed a gang, referred to as the Rustlers, or simply Billy the Kid's gang, who survived by stealing and rustling as he did before. On December 15, 1880, Governor Wallace put a $500 reward on Billy's head, and Pat Garrett began a relentless pursuit of the outlaw. Garrett set up many traps and ambushes to apprehend Billy, but the Kid seemed to have an animal instinct that warned him of danger, but that was not to last. Billy the Kid and his gang of rustlers were captured on December 23, 1880. Billy was first taken to a jail in Las Vegas, New Mexico, then to Santa Fe, and eventually to Mesilla. But again, on April 28, Billy somehow escaped and killed both of his guards while Garrett was out of town. It is not known how Billy could do this, but it is widely believed that a friend or regulator sympathizer left a pistol in the privy that one of the guards escorted Billy to daily. But Billy didn't leave forever. He lost his life that he had lived by killing 21 men. Number 3, Tom Horn Janar. Tom Horn Janar was a hired killer who was good at the bad he did. Born in 1860 in Memphis, Missouri, Horn reportedly showed an aptitude for hunting and marksmanship at an early age. After moving westward in the mid-1870s, Horn was many things, from a cowboy, miner, army scout, deputy sheriff, and packer for the Rough Riders in Cuba. But his most notorious career was as a hired gun. Horn first worked for the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency, which hired him to track down and apprehend Western outlaws who were preying on Pinkerton clients like banks and railroads that could afford to pay for private law enforcement where the public system failed them. But after 4 years as a Pinkerton, Horn had become bored, and in 1894 he signed on as a hired killer with the privately run Wyoming Cattlemen's Association. For several years, the big Wyoming cattlemen had been fighting a vigilante war in Johnson County against a diverse group of small farmers, sheep ranchers, and rustlers who were resisting their domination. By 1894, negative publicity had made a public war too costly. Instead, the ranchers shifted to more stealthy means, hiring Horn to use his gun-handling skills to deadly effect by ambushing and murdering any man the ranchers marked as a troublemaker. Horn was a crazy gunslinger. He often shot from as much as 200 yards away, so most of his victims never even saw what hit them, which means they never saw Horn. However, in November 2019, the infamous hired killer Tom Horn was hanged for having allegedly murdered Willie Nickel, the 14-year-old son of a southern Wyoming sheep rancher. Number 2, Sam Bass. Sam Bass was a noted outlaw and train robber who led 2 gangs during the days of the Wild West. Sam Bass was known as an honest young man. He came in possession of a small race pony, a little sorrel mare. When most of the neighborhood boys met in Denton on Saturday evenings, Bass raced his pony with much success. His boss soon noticed he was neglecting his work for the pony, so he was asked to choose between his job and the pony. Guess what he chose? His pony. That was what became a turning point for Sam Bass. Bass got another job as a cowboy for Joel Collins, who gambled away all the money he got from his herd, even though he bought his cattle on credit. Collins became desperate, and with a band of his cowboys, known as the Black Hills Bandits, he held up and robbed several stagecoaches. These robberies brought Collins very little booty, but they started Sam Bass on his criminal career. Bass continued robbery with his gang and would kill anyone if need be. One day, a gunfight ensued, and as Bass attempted to flee, he was shot by Texas Rangers agents George Harold and Sergeant Richard Ware. Bass was later found lying in a pasture west of Round Rock by Williamson County Deputy James Milton Tucker. More specifically, Bass had to call out to the posse as they were about to ride by him, shouting, "Hey, I'm over here! I'm Sam Bass, the one you were looking for!" He was taken into custody and died the next day on July 21, 1878, his 27th birthday. Number 1. Jesse James. Last but not the least is Jesse James. He was an outlaw, bank, train robber, Confederate guerrilla during the Civil War, and James' younger gang leader. He rebelled against a society he didn't like late in America's 2nd century and became a folk hero. Jesse James was touted as the modern-day Robin Hood because it was said that he robbed the rich and was kind to the poor. However, while Jesse was many things people perceived as good, he was also a cold-blooded murderer, robber, horse thief, and terrorist. He and his gang were very dangerous men, but his gang was targeted and almost annihilated. Jesse needed someone to trust, and so he confided in the Ford brothers. He even took these brothers into his family for protection, unknown to him that he had just housed his doom. Soon, Jesse began to suspect that the Fords were up to something bad, but instead of confronting them, Jesse walked around the room with his gun. As he turned around, he saw a dusty picture he wanted to dust. As he reached for it, Robert Ford drew his weapon and shot the unarmed Jesse James in the back of the head. It turned out that the Ford brothers betrayed their friend for a reward the government had promised. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.